After a 12-hour shift under the blistering sun at the base, Staff Sergeant Angela Morris, a decorated black Marine with over 3 dozen commendations, her boots still caked in dust, pulled into the parking lot of Grant Memorial High, heart pounding not from fatigue, but from pride. Today, her son Jordan was graduating top of his class, valedictorian, full ride to Stanford, and the first in their family to make it that far. She didn't stop to change out of her uniform. There was no time. And besides, she wore it with pride. Inside the gym, families laughed, cameras clicked, balloons bobbed in school colors overhead. Angela moved quietly to a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention. She didn't need the spotlight, just the chance to watch her baby boy cross that stage. But moments before the ceremony began, 2 security guards approached, stiff in posture, whispering apologies she didn't ask for. "Ma'am, we've had a few complaints. Some parents are uncomfortable with your presence. We're going to have to ask you to leave." At first, Angela blinked, thinking maybe she misheard, but the tone was firm, dismissive. She looked around, some eyes on her with curiosity, others avoiding her gaze entirely. No one stood up. No one said a word. She felt it again. That old, familiar ache of being judged by the color of her skin before the strength of her soul. Still, she stood slowly, her pride not wounded but weighed down. And that's when it happened. 4 men in crisp suits, quiet, composed, and seated across the aisle, stood in unison. No announcement, no fanfare, just presence. One of them, a tall man with a fading sealed trident tattoo barely visible at the edge of his cuff, stepped between the guards and Angela. "With all due respect, sir, this woman has more right to be here than anyone in this room," he said, voice even but unshakable. The others flanked him silently, eyes forward, backs straight. The guards stammered, unsure what to do. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, went still. A whisper rippled through the rows. "They're SEALs. Those are Navy SEALs." Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else murmured, "What's going on?" Jordan, standing backstage in his gown and cap, peeked out and saw his mother surrounded, not by hostility but by honor. The principal, now aware of the situation, rushed in, trying to regain control, offering Angela a front row seat instead. But she declined. She didn't come for recognition. She only wanted to witness her son's moment. The SEALs didn't sit, either. They stood near her through the entire ceremony like silent sentinels. When Jordan's name was called, and he stepped up to the podium to give his valedictorian speech, his eyes locked on his mother's, still standing in the back with the 4 men beside her. "Everything I've achieved," Jordan began, voice cracking with emotion, "is because of the woman in uniform back there. That's my mom, a Marine, my hero." The crowd erupted, not in protest, but in applause. People rose to their feet, some with tears, some with guilt, but all now seeing what they failed to see before. Not just a uniform, but the human inside. It. Afterward, dozens came to Angela to shake her hand, to apologize, to thank her. But she didn't stay long. She wasn't there for praise. She was there for her son. As they walked out of the gym, mother and son side by side, the SEALs nodded and disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. No names, no explanations, just a gesture of brotherhood and respect. That moment became legend in Grant Memorial High. Teachers spoke of it for years. Students carried it in their hearts. And for once it wasn't a headline about conflict, but about silent courage, unshakable dignity, and how sometimes the strongest stand is the one taken without a word. Angela never told anyone what she was thinking when the guards tried to move her out, but Jordan knew, and so did those SEALs. Because when you wear that uniform, and you've carried the weight of war and motherhood on your back, you don't back down, you stand. Even when you stand alone. Especially then. As they exited the gym, Angela's boots echoed softly on the pavement. a rhythm that had walked through war zones and base camps, now leading her son into a new battlefield. Life. Jordan clutched his diploma tightly, but what he held even tighter was the invisible strength his mother had passed down to him. She didn't speak, and she didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any speech, deeper than any applause. But the story wasn't over when they left that gym. The local news caught wind of it. Someone's cell phone footage had gone viral. Marine mom asked to leave graduation. What happened next? Will leave you speechless, the headline read. And for once, it wasn't clickbait. Within 24 hours, thousands had shared the video. Veterans groups, teachers, parents, students. Black servicewomen commented in droves, some saying they'd felt that same silent scrutiny in civilian spaces. Some said they'd never seen anyone stand up for them like that. And then the story hit national news. Angela's phone rang endlessly. Reporters, activists, military officials. But she turned them all down. "I'm not a hero," she told Jordan quietly at dinner that night. "I'm your mother. That's enough." But word reached further than she expected. A week later, a letter came from the Pentagon, sealed and stamped with weighty reverence. Inside, a commendation not for her years of service, but for her courage in civilian life, for showing restraint, dignity, and strength in the face of prejudice, without ever needing to raise her voice. "You reminded this country," it read, "what a uniform truly means, not power, but purpose." Jordan read it twice, then 3 times. His chest swelled with pride, but also with something more. Conviction. That night, he told her he was applying for ROTC, not because he had to, because he wanted to follow her footsteps, not just in service, but in principle. Weeks passed. The school invited Angela back, not to apologize again, but to speak. At first, she refused. But one day, after Jordan left for work, she sat on the porch, looked at her worn boots, and thought of every black woman who had been told to shrink, herself. She picked up the phone. The auditorium was packed the day she spoke. No fancy speechwriters, no teleprompter. Just Angela in her uniform, standing beneath a banner that read, "Honor where it's due." Her voice was calm, measured, but the room was silent. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," she began. "I came here because too many people in this world think dignity can be taken away. It can't. Not unless you let it. That day I didn't walk out. I stood still. And the world moved around me." The standing ovation was thunderous, but short, because Angela didn't linger. She never did. She stepped off stage and walked home the same way she always had, with quiet grace. Meanwhile, Jordan thrived. His story, their story, was written into college essays and quoted at military recruitment ceremonies. But more importantly, it became a legend that taught others how to see differently. Because in the end, it wasn't the applause, the news, stories, or the Pentagon letter that meant the most. It was the moment a mother stood tall not to prove anything, but to be everything her son had ever believed her to be. And years later, at Jordan's own military commissioning ceremony, when the commanding officer called out, "Please rise for the one who inspired this journey," every head turned as Angela stood, older, prouder, and more radiant than ever. The crowd clapped. The brass played, but it was Jordan's salute, trembling and fierce, that said what no microphone could. It said, "You were never alone, Mom," and neither was she. Because now the world had seen her, not just in uniform, but in truth. 2 years later, on a breezy spring afternoon, Jordan Morris stood at the gates of Fort Benning, Georgia, the last echoes of boot camp behind him and the weight of his mother's legacy now worn not only in his uniform but in every choice he made. His commanding officers often said he had a steadiness beyond his years, a calm under pressure that didn't waver, didn't crack. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know it came from watching a woman hold her ground in a gym full of strangers who tried to make her feel small, and how she never let them succeed. Every mission briefing, every sunrise drill, every moment he wanted to give less than everything, Jordan remembered that day. The guards, the silence, the 4 men who rose like mountains beside her, and the way she never flinched. That memory didn't haunt him, it fueled him. Meanwhile, Angela's life didn't slow down. She remained active on base, training young recruits, especially women of color, many of whom called her Ma before their first month was over. She didn't try to preach. She simply lived by example. Her story was passed around not by her, but by those who had seen it unfold. A quiet legend. She got letters from young women in Detroit, from veteran nurses in Florida, from teenage girls in Texas who saw themselves in her strength. One letter stood out. It was from the youngest daughter of one of the security guards from the graduation. She was 17. She wrote, "I was in the bleachers that day. I watched my dad ask you to leave. I've never stopped thinking about it. You didn't yell, you didn't cry. But I saw power. I want to be like that. I want to be better than what we were taught." Angela folded that letter carefully and kept it inside her Bible. In time, the school district added a plaque to the gym's entrance, a bronze engraving that read, "To those who stand tall without raising their voice, in honor of Staff Sergeant Angela Morris, USMC." The 4 Navy SEALs? No one ever got their names. They never came forward, never sought attention. But some say that same group has shown up to other events, funerals, retirements, even a school board meeting in Ohio where a veteran teacher was being pushed out unfairly, like shadows of justice, quiet defenders. Angela often wondered how they knew to stand. Maybe it wasn't about her. Maybe it was about what she represented. Years passed. Jordan became an officer, then a leader. He started a mentorship program for kids in underfunded schools who had parents in the military, naming it Operation Still Standing. When interviewed, he always said, "This program started in a high school gym, before I even had a diploma." And when the interviewer asked what made his mother so special, he didn't mention her medals. He didn't need to. "She knows who she is," he said, "even when the world tries to tell her otherwise. That's her superpower." One fall evening, Angela stood on her porch, the sun dipping behind the horizon, a glass of iced tea in hand. Her knees a little stiffer than they used to be, her shoulders still straight. She looked across the street and saw the neighbor's daughter practicing her graduation speech. She smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks for recognition, but the kind that knows a seed has been planted and is growing. She didn't need the world to remember her name. She only hoped they'd remember how she made them feel, that strength doesn't always shout, and sometimes the most powerful protest is just standing your ground and refusing to disappear. And, long after the headlines faded, long after the cameras moved on, that moment in the gym lived on. Not in grand speeches or national monuments, but in the hearts of people who had once looked away, now looking differently. A Marine, a mother. A moment that stood still and made the world shift, ever so slightly, toward something better. Years continued to pass, and with them came change, not just in Angela's life but across the country. Inspired by her story, a documentary filmmaker created a short film titled The Quiet Salute, capturing not only that unforgettable moment in the high school gym, but the deep cultural ripple it created. It featured interviews with students who had graduated that day, some of whom admitted they hadn't understood the weight of what happened until much later. One young woman, now a lawyer, said, "I didn't know the strength it took to stay standing when the world tries to erase you quietly, but I do now." The documentary went on to win several awards at independent film festivals, and though Angela humbly declined to attend the premieres, Jordan went on her behalf, standing tall in his officer's blues and telling audiences, "This isn't about my mother being asked to leave, it's about her choosing to stay. That's a different kind of power." Back in her hometown, Angela continued to volunteer at the local community center, quietly mentoring young girls whose mothers were serving overseas. She taught them not just about respect and discipline, but about dignity and how to protect it. One of those girls, Ava, age 13, clung to every word Angela said. Her father was deployed, her mother juggling 3 jobs, and Ava had begun to lose faith in herself. But Angela saw her. One afternoon, after a self-defense lesson, Ava pulled her aside and whispered, "Do you think I could ever be as strong as you?" Angela knelt down, met her eyes, and said, "You already are. You just haven't had your moment to prove it yet." And when Ava, years later, stood at her own graduation podium as the first black female ROTC captain in her school's history, she opened her speech with just one line. "This is for the woman who stood when others wanted her gone and changed my life without even knowing it." Meanwhile, Jordan, now Captain Morris, was stationed overseas. During a mission in a tense village negotiation, an elder approached the American team, wary, cautious. But when Jordan stepped forward, calm, respectful, and unshaken, something shifted. Later, a translator told him, "He said you carry the spirit of a mother who walks without fear." Jordan didn't respond out loud, but in his chest, he carried her steady heartbeat, the strength that could face a crowd of judgment and still refuse to bend. Back home, Angela received a handwritten invitation, this time from the White House. A private ceremony was being held to honor military families who had demonstrated exemplary courage and character. The letter mentioned her name specifically. "You showed the nation what it means to hold one's ground with honor," Jordan flew in to accompany her. As they walked through the grand hallways, cameras flashing, generals standing at attention, Angela didn't smile for show. She smiled because she understood now. Sometimes, standing still ripples farther than 1,000 marches. At the ceremony, when her name was called, she didn't give a long speech. Just a few words that echoed through the hearts of everyone present. Don't ask to be seen. Just be someone worth seeing. The applause that followed was not polite. It was soul-deep. People stood not just out of protocol, but out of reverence. The final chapter of her story, though still being written, came one quiet Sunday morning. Angela sat alone in the pews of a small church. The choir had just finished singing. The pastor approached the podium and said, "Today's message is about strength, but not the kind that shouts, the kind that stands, like a tree planted beside still waters." He paused, looked directly at Angela, and added, "Some of us know what that looks like. Some of us learned because we saw it, right here in our town." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The entire congregation turned slightly toward her in unspoken gratitude. She closed her eyes for a moment, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. Not from sadness, but from something else. Peace. Because she knew now that the moment she stood in that gym hadn't been hers alone. It belonged to every woman who had ever been overlooked, every veteran dismissed, every parent told they didn't belong. She had held the line, and through her, others had found theirs. And long after her boots were finally set aside, worn and softened by years of quiet battles, they were displayed in a glass case at the local Veterans Museum. Below them, a plaque read simply, "She stood, so others could stay." ChatGPT said, years later, after Angela had officially retired from the Corps, her life settled into a peaceful rhythm. But even in stillness, her presence moved people. She bought a small cottage near a lake surrounded by pine trees and crisp, morning air, the kind of place where the silence was restorative, not lonely. But Angela was never fully removed from the world. Letters still came, stacks of them every month, some from young Marines, others from mothers, daughters, teachers, even strangers who'd read about the Marine mom who stood her ground. Many weren't seeking advice, they simply needed to be seen. And Angela read everyone. Her porch became a quiet sanctuary, not just for her, but for those she invited to visit. Young service members passing through, local kids needing guidance, neighbors who somehow just felt better in her company. She didn't offer lectures. She offered presence. And in that, people found something rare: stability. One afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled around the lake's edge, Angela was visited by a young journalist writing a book on modern acts of silent resistance. She asked if Angela ever wished she had stood up to the gods more forcefully, raised her voice, challenged them publicly. Angela looked out at the lake for a long moment before answering. "No," she said quietly. "If I had shouted, they would have remembered the noise. But because I stood still, they had to face the silence, and silence is where truth lives." That quote made the cover of the book, later adapted into a college curriculum on civic dignity and personal agency. Meanwhile, Jordan had climbed the ranks, now Major Morris. He'd led humanitarian missions, negotiated with generals, spoken before Congress on behalf of military families. Yet at every ceremony, every award, every gala dinner in his honor, he always told the same story. Not about the war zones, not about the medals, but about the gymnasium, the guards, the silence, and his mother who never wavered. "That day," he often said, "was the day I learned how real power works. It doesn't flex. It doesn't force. It just is." Eventually, Angela received another invitation, this time to speak at Arlington National Cemetery during a Memorial Day ceremony. She hesitated. She had never liked speaking in front of crowds, but something pulled her to say yes. On that solemn day, dressed in her best uniform one last time, she walked slowly to the podium, eyes scanning rows of flags, headstones, families clutching folded triangles of cloth. She didn't bring notes. She simply looked up and said, "Every grave behind me is a voice, and every voice deserves to be heard, even if it never made a sound in this world. I once stood still and let silence speak for me. Today, I stand for them, so their silence is not forgotten." The ceremony ended in quiet reverence. Not applause, not music, just the wind moving gently through the trees. Later that year, her story was added to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, not in the Hall of Heroes, but in the exhibit on honor in daily life. It was titled, "The Stand That Taught Us to Listen." In the final seasons of her life, Angela took to gardening. She liked the way roots grew unseen, silently holding everything together beneath the surface. "A bit like mothers," she would say with a smile, pulling weeds or planting seeds while the sun poured down. Her health began to slow her, arthritis in her knees, a touch of breathlessness climbing stairs, but her spirit never dimmed. Jordan visited her weekly, sometimes bringing new Marines she was said to have inspired. She welcomed them with lemonade and a quiet strength that felt like home. When Angela passed, it was a peaceful morning in early spring. Birds chirped, flowers had just begun to bloom, and a copy of a letter from a young black woman newly commissioned in the Air Force Academy rested by her bedside. Jordan held her hand until the last breath. And then, as promised, he arranged a quiet burial with full honors, but without spectacle. Just her, the flag, the wind, and the people who had learned how to stand because she once had. On the back of her gravestone was etched a single line, chosen by Jordan after weeks of searching for the right words. She never raised her voice, but she lifted the world. And in generations to come, in schools and bases and quiet acts of resistance across the country, the story of Staff Sergeant Angela Morris, the Marine mom who stood when others looked away, would continue to teach us all what real strength looks like. And so the story ends, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with the steady, enduring echo of a woman who didn't ask for the world to notice her, but changed it all the same. Staff Sergeant Angela Morris became more than a mother, more than a Marine. She became a symbol, not of loud rebellion, but of quiet, immovable strength. Her legacy didn't live in medals or monuments, but in the choices others made after witnessing her stand. Choices to look again, to speak up, to see what they once ignored. In every corner of the country, her story found roots. In classrooms, teaching dignity before debate. In leadership programs, quoting her words. In young women, especially black women, who no longer questioned their right to belong in any room. And in every school gym, every quiet injustice, every moment someone hesitates between shrinking back or standing tall, the memory of that day, the day one mother refused to be moved, whispers like a promise. You are not invisible, and you are not alone, because real change doesn't always march in. Sometimes, it walks in after a 12-hour shift, sits in the back, and stands when it matters most. The end.